Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Melbourne Conversations on our inclusive recovery. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne on the third Wednesday of every month. Today, I'm joined by a fabulous panel, Betty Otho, Sam Zondi, and John Richardson. Welcome. We're going to be talking about the opportunity to build an inclusive and sustainable recovery from COVID. We welcome your questions, and you can submit questions throughout the event, and we'll answer some of them at the end. There's a QR code that is now on your screens. You can use that to submit your questions. You can also subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversation events. Before we kick off, on behalf of City of Melbourne, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Bunurong Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. My name is Rushta Khaled, and I'm excited to have this conversation with Betty, Sam, and John today. Why is an inclusive recovery important? We know that COVID has hit us hard, hit communities hard, has had devastating health, social, and economic impacts for our city and for our people. We've seen the job and business losses. We've seen a rise in housing and food security, loss of social connection, and impacts on mental health, just to name a few of the impacts. We also know that the impacts of COVID and the lockdowns haven't affected everyone in the same way. There are people and communities who were already struggling before the pandemic hit and were facing systemic inequities, which have only been exacerbated by the pandemic and the lockdowns. If we don't pause here and address these issues now, they will become further entrenched. Our reactivation plans need to remember that cities are first and foremost places for people. We need to take the time across all levels of government and in partnership with leaders from our communities, business, environment, and the arts to collectively prioritize long-term and integrated responses as part of our recovery. We now have the opportunity to build back better. Earlier this year, we talked to our communities about their vision for the future of Melbourne. We heard Melburnians want Melbourne to be a city of possibility where people can feel hopeful and positive about their future. The top priority for Melburnians was for the city to be healthy and safe. 1 in 5 people said their priority for Melbourne was to be inclusive, accessible, and affordable. They want the diversity of Melbourne's people, places, and businesses to be at the core of our identity as a livable city. An inclusive recovery is about addressing the exclusion and these long-term systemic inequities that COVID has laid bare. It's about overcoming the economic distress that we're facing, but in a way that provides opportunity for everyone to benefit from a revitalized economy. It's also about making sure we think about long-term sustainable and integrated responses, looking at how we integrate across social and economic outcomes, and we can't forget the environment either. Our COVID recovery provides a key opportunity for us to ensure that no community is left behind and can propel us towards building a more just, inclusive, and resilient society. So, I might just start with an opening question to all our panelists, and I'd love for you to introduce yourselves as you get cracking as well. You work with very distinct communities in your everyday work. What have been some of the impacts of COVID you've observed from your communities and clients? Betty, we might start with you.
Thank you, Rushka. Hi, everybody. So, to introduce myself, I'm Betty Otho. I am a proud African Australian woman who has lived most of my life here in Melbourne. Migrated to Melbourne in 1998, and in Tullamarine, walked into Tullamarine Airport and essentially started my life here with my family. Since then, I've essentially grown up in Melbourne, went to school in Melbourne, and now a proud HR professional of over 12 years experience. I'm also a proud businesswoman as well, a African Australian businesswoman, and I also own and co-founded a online job platform called Diftel. So I do wear a few hats, and I am a part of a few communities. So I guess maybe I'll start with essentially the impact it has with the hat of being a African Australian, South Sudanese to be specific. So during COVID, I actually lived in London, but I do know that some of the impacts it has had on my community because I only did just come back this year, and COVID was very much still alive, and essentially we thought it had ended, but it's still going. So being part of the African Australian community, I think some of the impacts has been positive, but also very much negative as well. I think maybe I'll start off with the positive. I think the positive element of an impact that I have seen has been the way that my community has connected with each other, seeing them all kind of moving to technology and engaging with technology and engaging with what's going on within Melbourne society as part of essentially being forced to, because essentially engagement completely changed. Before, we are very much a collectivist community, and you find a lot of diverse communities are. So we find that we connect with each other by being in each other's houses, by going to events, but that very much changed with the impacts of COVID. So I saw that my community, even those who were a little bit older, were connecting with technologies and finding new ways to gain their information and stay connected with each other. So I think that was a positive to start off with. But I know essentially there would have been a lot of negatives. So again, because again, we are a collectivist community, I saw my community really struggle with isolation. I saw mental health being a really, really big driver, especially for younger generation, and parents essentially kind of looking at their kids going, who are you? Because again, being really much faced with some of the isolation and mental health, but also the inequalities that their kids probably have felt that they haven't really seen, all kind of being pushed to their face. And unfortunately, we have seen actually quite a few suicides happen in the last 2 years. And I know that's very morbid to say, but I think, I wouldn't be doing it justice and shying away from some of the real impacts of isolation and mental health, all kind of grappling at once due to the impacts of COVID. And from a professional sense, and from a client point of view, as part of my online job platform, I actually launched a recruitment platform called Diftal right in the midst of COVID. I know, deciding to essentially launch in the midst of COVID, and it's all about recruitment. So I really felt the impacts of COVID. And you could probably ask, why would I have still gone ahead and launched my job platform? It's because my job platform is actually tailored for a target audience of BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous people of color, a group that has faced inequalities within the recruitment process, within the employment process, even pre-COVID. So when we were just about to launch, not knowing COVID was about to hit us, we decided to still go ahead and launch our job platform because we knew more now so than ever, as you said, Rushka, that this group were about to face even more inequalities with recruitment freezes and essentially elements like D&I being the first to be put on the shelf as not being a focus anymore. So we really felt that, and a lot of our clients did come to us and say, yes, we're ready to post a job, but actually we can't do that anymore because of recruitment freezes, and D&I is no longer a focus. So we really did feel that, and my clients essentially did really feel that in terms of job opportunities. So we really had to pivot and work on job readiness, as we knew that the market would change and it would open again. And we are definitely seeing that the market has changed from an employment point of view, but it was definitely a difficult time for my clients, and one that we did not give up on, essentially. So lots of impacts.
Yeah, lots to take in there, Betty, and your own personal experience of starting um, a company or a business in the middle of this pandemic, or at the start of this pandemic, is probably an impact that many people and businesses have felt that impact as well. I can also relate to some of your comments, Sam. I'm a proud, happy Sri Lankan woman, and also coming from a collectivist community and culture, and can absolutely relate to some of your thoughts there. I might throw to Sam next to talk about his observations.
Thanks, Rushda, and thanks, Betty. That's really enriching, those insights. Look, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all assembled and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Um, Look, it's been interesting. I have the privilege to lead an organisation that provides services to and is an ally to people with disability. And my comments and my reflections on the question you've posed, Rushta, are very much through the lens of our customers and the people that we support on a day-to-day basis. And I guess, as a starting point, when we saw COVID emerge and the health response start to shape around it, one of the most kind of clear, I guess, observations was that the unique health needs and challenges of people with disability were often, forgotten in the conversation in terms of the way the health response was directed to particular more vulnerable groups, in terms of the resources and efforts that were put towards ensuring that people with particular vulnerabilities were protected from COVID. We found, disappointingly, but perhaps not unexpectedly, that the voice of people with disability was often missing in that dialogue. What we see amongst our customer group and the people that we support is certainly the health challenges being quite acute through this period. And as a result of that, people are more socially isolated than perhaps they were prior to COVID. There's certain hesitancy in re-emerging and re-exposing to potential infection risks as people reconnect with their communities and re-engage with those social connections. And equally, we see in the employment market for people with disability that whilst there were barriers prior to COVID, often we find that people are further back in the queue than they were prior to COVID. So there's a lot of work needing to be done to re-elevate and reprioritise people who are facing barriers to employment at the front of that queue. And there's certainly work to be done around that. Mental health, I don't think any conversation, and I think certainly COVID has opened up and destigmatised the conversation around mental health. And certainly that's no different for the people that we work with, but also, my staff and, my teams included. Mental health and I guess the challenges that people have experienced throughout COVID were heightened, and we're still seeing the residual impacts of that as we start to re-emerge. High levels of anxiety, high levels of social isolation and loneliness, and trying to bridge the gap between what was pre-COVID and the now post-COVID normal is challenging to say the least. The other part that we've observed is, and I think we hear this term in other contexts, but I guess the trust deficit. So for people that have been marginalised through this period, there's a fairly significant divide that we still have to bridge so that people feel confident, that they feel safe, that they feel supported and welcomed back into spaces and opportunities and conversations that they were previously either just starting to gain access to or perhaps were at the fringes of. So we have considerable work to do as a collective to try and bridge that divide.
Yeah, absolutely, Sam. And some of the reflections I've also heard from others is a need for healing before we move forward. We've been through some harrowing experiences as a community, and the impacts of COVID, but also the trust deficit that you talk to. Thank you for those insights. John, I might throw to you now for your observations and insights.
Thanks, Rushta, and yeah, I too would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Bunurong people down by the waters of Nerm, and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and of course anyone who might be participating on this this webinar who might be from the First Nations. I probably take a bit of a different perspective than Betty and Sam. So I work with the Red Cross in a sort of national and sort of nationwide role. I'm National Resilience Advisor, so I provide sort of a technical advice on sort of disaster resilience and disaster recovery. So a lot of, I suppose, my reflections are a little bit sort of almost kind of around society-wide sort of impacts. And I think, we certainly saw society challenge. And one of the interesting things for me was that, because I've been doing this work for a very long time, I have been involved in sort of pandemic planning sort of in the 2000s. And I suppose for me, the sort of planning that we were doing was not far removed from sort of dystopian fiction, because when you sort of look at the potential for how things could unfold. So as the sort of pandemic did unfold, there was always this sort of thing in the back of my head, is that what could this be? What could this sort of unfold like? And that was certainly a source of sort of stress and anxiety, sort of living in the middle of the disaster as whilst you're actually sort of trying to manage it, which is very much like a lot of our local governments managers do, whether it's a bushfire or a flood or cyclone like. So really quite different focus, this sort of society-wide challenging the sort of fundamentals that we kind of accept, that as our norms were suddenly not there. We go about our lives supported by a bunch of systems that make our lives work, and when they don't work, then things like this run out. So and that's the sort of stuff that really we kind of laughed about toilet paper running out, but that was actually a systems failure, and so there's a lot of those sorts of things that were sort of unfolding. I guess this is sort of what we've done quite a bit of work around the sort of notion of collective trauma, and the idea of that is that it's how a community is affected by an event and is fundamentally challenged by that. And as you're saying, Risha, that there sort of needs to be kind of a healing sort of component. And so I think that's the sort of thing that sort of comes to mind with the sorts of things that we're seeing. But equally, we saw a lot of collaboration, whether it's within communities or whether it's across communities. I think the other thing that was we saw was that when people were asked to do things, they did them. Now I've seen commentators sort of sneer and sort of say, Australians, they just they think they like to be tough, but they're actually they just do what they're told. But in fact, what that was is that actually people understanding the risk and the challenges, and when being told that to do these things, they went, okay, we're doing this for the greater good. And all that sort of staying home, rolling up our sleeves, those sorts of things, people are sort of thinking about that and essentially doing it in the main, not everyone, for the greater good. So we saw some of those sort of positives, some of those negatives. There certainly is challenges, I think, in as both Sam and Betty have mentioned, around mental health and and understanding, what the long tail of this is going to be. We understand sort of from other sort of pandemics and epidemics that there will be this sort of long tail, and sort of understanding that. And I think that's going to be a challenge, because there's sort of real desire for us to snap back. Let's just get back and let's not worry about, like, great, we can go out to the bars and we can go out and do whatever. That's what we want, but we have to make sure that that we recognise that that these sort of long tails, which will sort of affect people, not just months, but possibly years, potentially decades.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Some really interesting insights and reflections there, and would love to delve deeper into some of those learnings in a minute. But I might just say, for anyone who's joined us a bit later, my name is Rushda Haleth, and you're watching Melbourne Conversations, Inclusive Recovery, with Sam Sondy, Betty Otto, and John Richardson. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by the City of Melbourne on the third Wednesday of every month. You can submit your questions throughout the event. We welcome your questions, and we'll try to get to some of those questions before the end of the event. Submit your questions by going to Slido and entering hashtag #MelbRecovery, or you can use the link or QR code that is now on your screens. All right. My next question is to John, just to pick up where you sort of finished, John, and to think about your work in disaster resilience and disaster recovery in contexts like bushfires and floods, and this urge we all have to kind of snap back that you reflected on as well. What are the lessons that we can draw from your experiences in other disaster contexts to shape how we think about a more inclusive COVID recovery?
Yeah, great question, Rusha. And I think that's, a lot of people will sort of say, oh, COVID's so different. And we even did some research on this when we asked people, can you prepare for COVID? And they go, oh, no, you can't. You can't prepare for this. So we do think about COVID as being different, and we will, because if you sort of think about starting at the start, like the hazard and the impact, and kind of working through, well, then of course a disease epidemic is very different to a bushfire, which is very different to a cyclone, which is very different to an earthquake. So if you look at it that way. But one of my favourite movies, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, there's a scene in there where Cheryl says to Walter Mitty, my creative writing teacher says you always start with the end of the story and work backwards, and that's what we sort of think about in recovery, is that we start at the end and work backwards, and so think about the consequences. So you look at the impacts, and you sort of think, okay, if there's an impact on a person's ability to earn an income, or their ability to house themselves, or the psychosocial impacts, it's almost like you focus on the impact and deal with the impact, rather than sort of thinking about the cause. And so you can apply what we call sort of national principles of recovery to any type of event. But I guess the other thing we've also got to be really mindful, I just want to talk about really briefly, is context as well. And so we tend to sort of take disasters, and the COVID pandemic is a disaster. Like it should be considered. We should be thinking about it in the same way, because we talk about disasters as being kind of these sorts of events that challenge and overwhelm our sort of capacities. If we sort of think about the context, we must make sure that that we're not sort of treating it separately to the world that we live in. So what is already there, and I think that is sometimes is forgotten. And certainly what Sam said sort of early on about what people bring into it is really sort of a challenge. So So you need to think about the context, what it is we're actually trying to aspire to. And I think the Sustainable Development Agenda 2030 agenda is really important here for us as to aspire to. This is the kind of world that we would like to leave behind as our sort of contextual piece. But one of the things we talk about with our focus on sort of disaster resilience is that we've got this definition, which is the ability of individuals and communities, etc., to prepare for, anticipate, reduce, and recover from the effects of shocks. I'm reading this; it's going blah 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 blah. But the key thing is the last bit of the sentence, which is without compromising their long-term prospects. And I think that's the thing we should be sort of really kind of mindful of. Is like, again, it's where do we want to be? What's the society do we want? So applying these principles, understanding the context, as I've said, recognizing the complexity of disaster. So it's not linear, and that's something that it tends to be forgotten. A lot of people are thinking about COVID as an economic disaster, and so we sort of see things as being like everything has to be sort of economically driven. But we've done some work that the University of Melbourne have led, which is called the Recovery Capitals, which looks at the complexity of recovery across a social, human, political, cultural, economic environment and built domains, and tries to look at how all those fit together. So decisions you might take in say one domain are considered in the others, and I think for decision making this is really important. Using community-led approaches, so making sure that we focus on participation, and this again is something that's perhaps. I'm not saying it's not well done necessarily, but it's something that we should be looking at. And this is how we could, if the right people are at the table at the right time, this is where we can start to promote sort of an inclusive recovery. Coordination is key, as is communication. We've sort of seen elements of good communication and sort of poor communication during sort of COVID. And capacity building. So if we want things to be managed and be sustainable from a sort of community level, and so that it is inclusive and people understand what's going on, then we need to acknowledge that there is already capacity in the community, and that needs to be supported and built out. So these are the sorts of principles I think we can certainly apply to this sort of scenario.
Rushka, I thought you had left. I was like, where are you?
Technical difficulties. Sorry about that. I just dropped off for a moment. John, some fantastic principles there for us to learn from. And the principles really bring to mind that there isn't a perfect answer for how you can go about doing this or a grand master plan for us to follow, but those principles are real guides that we can use to really guide the how we go about doing it, and takes the focus away from having that, sort of perfect roadmap in place. Particularly the community-led, community voice component really resonated, and the need for more integrated responses across the different domains when we are making those decisions as well, and the capacity building piece you spoke to. Fantastic. Betty, I might go to you next, just building on that conversation. Some might say, this has been a pretty difficult period, a pretty difficult couple of years for everyone. We have enough on our hands right now, just getting by and trying to make things work. Why is now the moment to be looking to an inclusive recovery and transformational change? Don't we have enough going on as it is? That might be a question.
Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing that could potentially still be a question, because it sounds a lot like the same type of answer I've gotten even pre the pandemic, when we want to talk about inequalities and acknowledging racial discrimination and essentially groups that are completely left out of conversations that need to be a part of the conversation, because whether you like it or not, and whether you know it or not, or whether you look around or not, Melbourne and Victoria specifically is becoming more multicultural than ever. And for you to just put a blind eye to that and really kind of go, is now the time? Is now the time? If anything, it's unfortunate that usually it takes quite large like elements, or sometimes things like pandemics, or, you know, I know it sounds terrible, but things like George Floyd dying the way he did and being captured via video to really make people realize things. I really want to challenge us to not be asking why now, but then just essentially be living, obviously, in the fact that there's no better time than the present, of course, but acknowledging that this question has been asked multiple times, even before a pandemic. If anything, I think we should pause and understand that a pandemic has really highlighted what happens when people are essentially left out of co-designing elements and not realizing that we live in a multicultural community, and realizing then a pandemic means, oh wait, we need to now actually communicate with people from cold backgrounds. We need every community to be aware of what needs to happen for us to be able to survive this pandemic together. I think what has happened is there's been a real realization because of the pandemic that we have not been co-designing. And if anything, there was a real rush. I saw government essentially running to diverse communities and saying, how do we connect with you? When if you had connected with us, you know, before a pandemic, you would have been ready and resilient enough to be able to deal with a pandemic. So when people ask that question of why now, I say because it's been highlighted what happens when we're not co-designing, we're not being inclusive of everyone, and then realizing actually we are a society that needs everyone to come together to be able to survive things like pandemics. There is now probably no reason to say why anymore. Maybe it's been highlighted. So I think there's no better time than the present, but let's not take away from the fact that there is a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of acknowledgement and awareness of some real discrimination and essentially real hatred sometimes, and essentially things that really need to be looked at that before we can even move towards an inclusive recovery. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but essentially I'm very much please don't ask me why again after a pandemic, because it has been highlighted in so many ways what happens when you're keeping people left out and running to them to be like, how do we make sure we have enough languages that talk about what's going on with COVID? So I think if we don't jump on the opportunity now, we'll only be left behind, because Australia is only becoming more multicultural. The aging population is becoming more multicultural. The new Generation Alpha, is even more diverse than you could ever imagine. So if we don't really take up the opportunity to understand the importance of creating that resilience, creating that co-design, and understanding that we need to be ready for many elements in terms of how we recover, then we will continuously stay behind. And you could probably see that from other cities as well who are not picking up. So I want to be a part of a city that is ready for anything that hits it. And if we don't essentially learn from it now, we'll constantly be rushing and we'll constantly be left behind from the rest of the world.
Wonderful reflections there, Betty. Thank you. And yes, let's not ask the guy now, because this is the moment. This is an opportunity. the issues have existed, as we've talked about, the inequalities have existed prior to COVID. And one of the key learnings that multiple governments at all levels across the globe have experienced is they've been trying to support their communities through this pandemic without having those foundations, the trust, the relationships, the connections, the understanding of the varied and diverse communities that make up our society. And that's been hard. It's made the COVID experience and the support that governments want to provide communities much harder. So some great reflections there. You think about these movements and moments that happen, whether it was the advocacy after the bushfires of last year or the Black Lives Matter movement, and feels like there are these sparks where you get this collective push to do bigger and better things. But then I don't know, is there a fickleness to our society where things kind of wane off after a little while, and it's the same groups who continue to advocate for those issues? So how is this a moment where that does not happen, and how can we do better? And that brings me to a question for you, Sam. You work with a wide range of stakeholders, including a lot of government clients and others. So what do you see as being the roles of government, business, and community as we move towards a more inclusive recovery?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Rushda, and it picks up on elements of what John and Betty have already shared with us, and a lot of what you've done in framing this discussion as well, Rushda. But I guess it's important to reflect on the 2 years that have been and understand the kind of dialogue and interactions that have happened. And it's fair to say that there's been an unprecedented level of collaboration and dialogue between those 3 actors that you just described: government, business, and community. And interestingly, in my observations, being part of some of those conversations, is there's been a genuine openness to listen in a way that certainly I haven't experienced before, and I haven't observed to the extent that we saw through the pandemic. Almost a willingness to hear difficult things, to have difficult conversations, and to kind of receive a warts and all view of what's happening on the ground, which was refreshing, right? And pandemics and disasters, in the way that John's described, it really does galvanise communities together to have those challenging conversations. But that's, in some respects, that response and reactive process is to some degree behind us. Okay, we're now at this unique kind of point, as you've described, Rushda. It's a moment in time which happens, in this transition from response to recovery, right? And this idea of building back better then needs to capture some of those, that energy and that intent that existed through that disaster phase. And I think what underpins it is maintaining those open lines of communication. So for those 3 actors to really work cohesively through the recovery phase, we can't go back into our silos. Okay, there needs to be that transparency and that openness to have those difficult conversations, more so now than we did back then. Okay, it's important that we set a very clear baseline for what success looks like as a collective as well, so that we're not just returning to normality as it was pre-COVID. We're actually returning to a better normal than existed pre-COVID. And that baseline has to be negotiated, because we all come to that with very different perspectives. It's not just traffic numbers returning and planes in the air and people at footy matches. It's about genuine inclusion. It's about understanding what didn't occur well prior to COVID, and how do we take this unique opportunity to right those challenges and those wrongs to some degree. And I think government plays a role as being the convener of that discussion. I think they played that role well during COVID, and I think it's certainly part of their remit to continue to convene that conversation. John said it, Betty said it, it's about who's around that table. It's about which voices are heard. It's about how diverse a mix of perspectives and views are there to help challenge what those understandings are and what those expectations are for the future. So not a simple answer, but I think it's underpinned by strong communication between those three groups. I think it's about setting a very clear understanding of what the baseline measures of success are, and they're going to be very different to what they were prior to that. And I think more importantly than anything, it's about making sure that we're directing our resources to those same ends, so that government, business and community are actually collectivising their resources and not redirecting them in different directions, often that cut off opportunity.
Thank you, Sam, and some interesting points that you raised there as well. Success measures, and talk about these success measures, and is there an opportunity to think about the legacy we want to leave behind, or the legacy we want to build from this COVID experience? We're fast forward 10, 20 years into the future, where has this experience taken us, and what is the legacy of what we can do now? I was just reflecting on some of your comments about having people at the table, which Betty's talked about and John's talked to as well. And I think it's not inclusion only for the sake of inclusion, or inclusion because it's the right thing to do. It's inclusion and having people at the table because of the advantageous and the positives that you get by having those diverse voices and different views and views around the table we build forward as well. We've had some interesting conversations. We're having an interesting conversation, and we've also had some questions come through. So I might take up some of the audience questions at this point and throw them to the panel. There's a question here around the initiatives that are currently being used overseas and possibly in other Australian cities that we can learn from that have particular value for Melbourne. Are there examples that we can learn from that you're seeing? That's part one of the question. And connected to that is, do our solutions need to be designed for Melbourne? That's an interesting question there. What can we learn from others, and do we need to have a bespoke approach for Melbourne?
I'm happy to start having a go at that. But Sam and Betty, feel free to jump in. Again, taking a principles-based approach. I mean, I can't really talk about sort of what's sort of happening elsewhere in a great amount of detail, but I think yes, it definitely you can look at sort of what's happening around the world, or what's happening around the country, and use that as inspiration. But I think if we come back to sort of a community-led approach, building off community capacity, these are sorts of things that should be identified as needs from within our community. And then there might be opportunity to say, okay, well, if I don't know, let's say we want to create spaces where people might come together to do really fun activities. Then you kind of go, okay, well, that's something that, well, we know that Christchurch has done that with their gap filler initiative after the earthquake. You might learn from that, but I think for it to be authentic and for it to be owned and embraced, then sort of these activities need to be driven from the ground up, because they're meeting kind of specific sort of needs and a context.
John, do you want to elaborate on that gap filler example that you talked about from Christchurch before I throw to Betty or Sam for their comments?
Yeah, sure. I'll really quickly go and have a look at it. So a lot of, after the earthquake in Christchurch 2011, there were a lot of spaces in Christchurch where buildings have been removed. Also, a lot of the creative arts community were lost their jobs. So they just came up with initiatives to fill the gap. So whether it might have been putting in a big chessboard in one place, or a Monopoly board, or a dancer mat where people could go along and plug in their iPod and just dance. And these things would change all the time. So they come up with ideas, and then they kind of change. And the idea of bringing people together, connection, giving people a little bit of hope, something a bit different. So yeah, that's the sort of initiative that's been going for 10 years and is really a fantastic idea.
That's a good one, John, and lots of relevance and similarities in how we're thinking about vacant shop fronts in heart of the city, and activation and involving the creative community and broader community as part of that. So that's a perfect example of taking something that's worked internationally and then adapting it to suit the Melbourne context as well. Betty or Sam, any thoughts on that question?
Look,
Yeah.
I'd just add the
Yep, go ahead. Gotta love
I'd just
technology.
add the observation. Yeah. Look, procurement and employing priority job seekers is are levers and are tools that we see used in other contexts, other jurisdictions, and I think we've seen procurement in particular from social enterprise being quite a powerful way to not only direct spend from governments, but also to direct it to organisations that specifically employ and train some of those priority job seeker cohorts. And jurisdictions like Scotland and Canada have piloted those methods for a number of years. And I think the strength of having those in place pre-pandemic strengthens the recovery, because it becomes the norm. It becomes the go-to rather than the new paradigm. Victoria's done it as well through the social enterprise or social procurement strategy and its refresh strategy that it released this year as well. But there are certainly lessons about how broad and how wide that policy is applied as to how quickly you can then recover and then include those that were previously excluded either from the labour market or from value chains of large organisations in government. So certainly those models exist. We have versions of them here in Victoria. And I think, to the earlier question you raised, Rushda, you'd always want to tailor it to a Melbourne context to make sure that it's fit for purpose and that the right people are shaping it.
Fantastic, Sam. And yes, procurement and social procurement is absolutely a lever that we need to be considering as part of this recovery. Betty.
Yeah, no, I think they're both really great points. The only element I would probably add is just around young people. I know an example of how London specifically utilizes grassroots youth-led initiatives to really look at spaces and recreating spaces to ensure that young people who come into the city, and you probably realize that young people probably make up a really large amount of the number of people who come into the city and just essentially looking for something to do in the city of Melbourne. So London has really utilized and brought those young people into spaces and got them to actually create the type of events, the type of spaces that they want to be in, and really utilized a lot of their knowledge and brought them into the conversation. So something I think we can really learn on how London has just utilized and embraced its diversity of those young people, as opposed to essentially wanting them to just go elsewhere or anything like that. So how do you bring them as part of the conversation, as opposed to just hope that they are not coming to the city or causing havoc or anything like that, really asking and getting them to create what they want to be doing in those spaces.
What a great approach, and investing in young people's connection to the city. Wonderful. There's another audience question that I might throw your way. An interesting one that reflects on a comment from Brett Sutton this Monday that said, a recovery phase was missing. Let me start again. That a recovery phase was missing from the government's roadmap. Brett Sutton said, we need time to plan for workforce responses as burnout and time for staff to recover will be crucial. Thoughts on how we can support our communities and families through this recovery phase, even if it's not officially recognized yet. John, I might start with you. This is your bread and butter a little bit, the recovery.
Yeah, the recovery, the sort of forgotten part of emergency management. We see this, and this used to be the same with bushfires and cyclones. As soon as the fire was out and the hoses were rolled up, it was like, that's it. We just move on. But we know it's people go through recovery. It is complex, and sometimes the recovery phase can actually be almost as challenging for people as the actual impact of the disaster. So I think a couple of things for us to be sort of thinking about in this instance, and this goes back to a comment you made right at the start, Urshka, is looking at a healing process. We do a lot around commemoration and memorialisation in disasters, and this is really important for communities to help make sense of what has happened. And I think this is important for us as a community to make sense of it, and to make meaning out of it. So what's the account? How will we describe this? How will we describe to our children who will describe to their children, sort of thing. What's the common narrative and what we can learn from. So it's a good, that's certainly something that I think is really important for us to be sort of thinking about, some sort of healing process. In terms of kind of providing sort of ongoing support is recognising that, again, we talk about recovery as being sort of a marathon and not a sprint, and so there's a couple of things in there. You need to take time to recover, and you don't run a marathon straight off. It does take time to build up to it and train for it, and that sort of thing. And the same goes, applying that sort of metaphor to sustaining the effort. But recognising that there's going to be this sort of long-term impact, but applying good psychosocial support principles, being connected, supporting each other, reaching out, living, healthy living. So, good diet, those sorts of things are really important. Validation, so validating sort of what people's experiences are is also really important. And of course, if these things are really distressing for people, and they're finding that it's really impacting on their lives and their ability to kind of live the life that they want to live, then seek help. Seek formal help. That's what it is there for. And again, that can kind of help potentially sort of reduce some of the stress and distress. So that's it's recognizing that there's it's a complex process, and you need to put principles. You need to put sort of a framework around it. And we talk about when I talk about long term, we're not talking about sort of weeks and months. We're talking about kind of years. And we see this with fire. So, so I think that would certainly be a really good starting point.
For John, and I think it starts with the healing, doesn't it? And then it's the sort of that collective piece around how we come to the collective imagining, the hope and the optimism about what we can create together. We've got another audience question, which builds on that recovery discussion, but how do we bring trauma-informed thinking into our recovery phase? How do we strike the right balance between acknowledging pain and building in the future of our cities? Sort of builds off what I just said as well. Sam or Betty, thoughts? How do you balance?
Betty, did you want to lead off?
Yep, sure. So I think it's acknowledging again, and I think it comes back down to understanding that we've lost 2 years of our lives, whether you want to say it or not. I mean, we need time to grieve that, whether that's a loss of the things you could have done in those 2 years, the connections you could have made, the people you would have met. There's a lot to grieve. So I think it really does go back to how do people grieve, and going back to people grieve differently, I think is usually the method. And I'm not a psychologist in any way, but I know that people do grieve differently. So it does go back to understanding there is going to be elements of PTSD, there's going to be elements of essentially grieving, and then going past and understanding that's going to be different for everybody and adapting to that as well. And I think the adapting part will come, and it will be something that everyone needs to be aware of, whether you are a duty holder, so essentially what we call anybody who has to take care of anyone, an employer or anything like that. You need to be aware of it. Whether you are within your family dynamics, you need to be aware of it and adapt to that accordingly, and support where you can. So very much back to everything that was discussed before, and going back to the experts and understanding what that means for different people is a really big element. And consulting with the right people to get the right advice is also an element that I would look at from a HR perspective, because I know from a HR perspective, I'm dealing with it very differently, because I know return to work means something different for everybody. The hybrid model means something different for everybody, and just social isolation and coming back into it and the anxieties behind that is also a very different element for everybody. And being ready to not go back to everybody go back. There isn't one way approach that we've usually had before the pandemic, which is, flexible working. It's flexible, but not really. But now it really has to be. And how does that look for everybody? So definitely putting all those elements into place as we move forward.
Great. Thank you, Betty. We're in the last sort of 5 minutes, and I'd like to pose a question to all of our panelists for your quick response. Let's assume that we get this right, and what would success look like if we achieve that genuine baseline that we would like to achieve? What's a blue sky idea you have for our long-term future? Sam, I'd come to you first.
Look, I wish there was one reflection that could encapsulate it. It's probably a lot of small things which build on each other and reinforce each other to kind of deliver that outcome. But fundamentally, for me and for the people that we work and support, it's about creating a city that's welcoming, that's safe, that's inclusive, and that really reflects the communities that make it up. And that's going to be expressed in so many different ways, Rushta, in terms of the leadership of, both from a governance perspective and from an executive. It's the language, it's the accessibility of the spaces, and it's the way it interacts with its partners and stakeholders that really defines the relationship. So I think it's this evolution, which is made up of all of these little wins along the way, that for me is what's going to define Melbourne in the next 10 years.
Thank you, Sam. John, some quick comments from you?
Look, I was thinking when the COVID-19 pandemic hits and Melbourne sort of looks at it and then kind of looks away and just says, okay, that's just a bit of a bump in the road. And I think that has happened because the first people that we've asked to help us prepare for and build our resilience are the people like Betty and like Sam. They're the first people that we ask and not the last people or the afterthoughts. So it's bringing everyone to the table, looking at, we've looked at, how can we be more resourceful? How can we build off the capacities and the smarts and the talent and the vibrance and the rest of our amazingly diverse community, so that when it does come, we just kind of go, oh yeah, okay, gee, that was a little bit annoying, but we can get on with being that kind of best city in the world sort of thing.
Nice one, John. And Betty, quick one from you. Blue sky.
No, so yeah, I just imagine a city of Melbourne where people like me can walk around, where we don't just feel like we're tolerated and are just a part of the city of Melbourne, but we're actually respected, embraced, and celebrated, and essentially are able to thrive. So I don't want just the city of Melbourne to be a place where it's just a livable city for people from diverse backgrounds, but it actually becomes a city where people from diverse backgrounds actually thrive. So I challenge you, city of Melbourne, let's do it together.
Brilliant. What a great note to end on, and what a fantastic conversation. I'd like to thank you all, John, Betty, and Sam, for joining me today. This has been a fabulous way to spend an hour. If you who's joined in as well and listened along, if you'd like to continue contributing to this conversation on inclusion and on an inclusive recovery, we currently have the public consultation open for the City of Melbourne Inclusive Melbourne Strategy. The consultation is open online until Sunday, 21st November, and we hope to hear from you. You'll be able to see a link now, I think, as well in the channel. Thanks so much for joining us for this Melbourne Conversations event. We run this event on the third Wednesday of every month, talking about a different topic. We're going to be taking a short break over December and January, and we'll come back with the first few talks for the 2022 program in January. Check out future events by searching Melbourne Conversations on the City of Melbourne website. And don't forget to subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week YouTube channel to stay up to date with the Melbourne Conversation events. There's also a link in the YouTube chat to a survey, and the City of Melbourne team would love to hear your thoughts on the event. Thanks again for joining us, and goodbye.
you.